The photograph. That turned out to be a warning. The photograph was cataloged for nearly a century as harmless, a curiosity at most. Two young men in identical dark suits, standing shoulder to shoulder before a painted studio backdrop, meant to suggest refinement, a library, books rising behind them in neat, impossible order. It had been reproduced in local histories, occasionally cited in lectures as an example of early interracial familiarity in the United States. No one had ever lingered on it long enough to feel uneasy. That changed in the spring of 2023. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The image arrived at a regional Midwestern museum, wrapped in thin brown paper, part of a small auction lot, liquidated after the death of a private collector. There was no provenance, no accompanying letter, no family name to anchor it. Only a single handwritten note, clipped to the backing board. United States, circa 1900. The archivist assigned to the intake almost passed it over. Early 20th century studio portraits were common. This one appeared no different. At first glance, it was almost reassuring. The white man stood on the left, clean-shaven, hair neatly parted. His posture was straight, practiced, the kind learned young. The black man beside him matched him in dress and stance. Same cut of suit, same high collar, same polished shoes. Their closeness seemed deliberate, even intimate. The white man's hand rested on the other's shoulder, a gesture long interpreted as familiarity or protection. Many had called it friendship, but the archivist did not catalog at first glance. She scanned. Under magnification, the photograph resisted its own surface narrative. The white man's fingers were not loose. They were rigid, pressed hard enough that the knuckles blanched pale against the darker fabric. The grip was not casual. It was controlled, measured, possessive. Then there was the other hand. The black man's free hand was clenched into a fist, held tight against his body, the tendons visible even through the stiff sleeve. It was not a pose of relaxation. It was restraint. Something held back, something prepared. The archivist enlarged the image further, isolating background details usually dismissed as decorative. That was when the most disturbing element emerged. In the lower right corner of the painted library backdrop, partially swallowed by shadow, hung a length of chain. Heavy, metallic, rendered with care. Photography studios did not paint chains into backdrops. The room where the archivist worked was quiet, climate-controlled, far removed from the world that produced the image. And yet the photograph seemed to push back against that safety. It was no longer a portrait frozen in time. It felt like a warning delayed. High-resolution scans revealed micro details invisible to the naked eye. Tension in the jaw, asymmetry in posture, the slight forward lean of one body, and the rigid stillness of the other. This was not a celebration. It was documentation. The archivist halted the intake process. She wrote in her internal notes that the photograph appeared deliberately composed to encode meaning. That phrase would later be struck from the public-facing description. The first attempt to contextualize the image framed it cautiously, perhaps a symbolic composition, perhaps an unusual studio prop. But privately, the language sharpened. The photograph did not depict harmony. It captured a moment of controlled danger. Someone had wanted this moment preserved. Someone had understood that a photograph could outlast testimony, outlast court records, outlast lives. That it could survive long enough to be misunderstood, until someone looked closely enough. The image was no longer treated as an artifact of social progress. It was flagged as potential evidence. Evidence of coercion, of proximity under threat, of a system that required visual proof because written truth would never be allowed to stand. In the archive ledger, the photograph received a new internal designation. Not portrait, not family, not friendship. It was listed quietly as a record of resistance. And whatever it was meant to reveal, it had waited more than 100 years for someone to notice where the hands were placed, and why. The first hypotheses and the historical context. The first report written about the photograph tried to soften its implications. Language was careful, academic, insulated. The archivist forwarded the scans to a social historian whose specialty lay in post-emancipation America, a man known for his restraint and methodical caution. When he arrived at the museum, he did not comment on the figures themselves. He asked instead about the year, the region, the paper stock, the studio conventions. He behaved as if distance might still be possible. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. He placed the enlarged print beneath a lamp and began with context, not conclusions. The early 20th century, he explained, was not a clean break from slavery, but a rearrangement of its machinery. Freedom existed in statutes, not in daily life. Across large swaths of the country, black men were trapped in systems designed to look legal. Debt peonage enforced by fabricated contracts, labor agreements signed under threat, arrests engineered to funnel men into convict leasing programs that quietly replaced plantation slavery with prison labor. He reminded the room that photographs from this era often lied, not by inventing scenes, but by framing them. Studios borrowed the language of respectability: books, columns, drapery, symbols of education and order. These backdrops were aspirational. They announced who was allowed to belong. The library backdrop, he argued, was not decorative. It was declarative. The two men had been placed inside a visual world that excluded one of them by law. The symmetry of their clothing did not signal equality. It challenged it. Such images were dangerous. They could not circulate openly. They had to be controlled, contextualized, softened, or forgotten. The historian paused when the archivist directed his attention to the lower right corner of the frame. The chain. He leaned closer, silent for a long moment. Chains did not appear accidentally, he said. Studio backdrops were painted months in advance, reused for years. Every object served a purpose. A chain had no place in a library, unless it was meant to be read symbolically. He proposed an initial hypothesis, one he would later revise. Perhaps, he suggested, the photograph documented a patronage relationship, a benefactor and a dependent, a white reformer and a black worker elevated by proximity. This interpretation had precedent. It was comfortable. It aligned with narratives long favored by institutions: benevolence rather than resistance, guidance rather than coercion. But even as he spoke, the hypothesis weakened. The gestures refused to cooperate. The clenched fist, the rigid grip, the absence of relaxation on both faces. This was not mentorship. It was surveillance, proximity under threat. The chain did not reference a past condition. It signaled a present one. The historian began to speak more quietly. He described how illegal systems after emancipation depended on plausible deniability. Violence was real, but records were clean. Men disappeared into labor camps through paperwork, not whips. Contracts replaced bills of sale. And when such systems were challenged, evidence vanished, files misplaced, cases dismissed, witnesses intimidated into silence. If someone wanted to preserve proof, he said, it could not be written plainly. Writing could be seized, testimony could be buried. But an image could be misread for generations and still survive intact. They returned to the photograph again, this time with different eyes. The hand on the shoulder was not protective. It was a reminder of control. The fist was not aggression. It was containment. Read together, the gestures formed a sentence without words. I am here. I am not free. I am being watched. The first hypothesis collapsed under the weight of its own convenience. What remained was something far more dangerous: the possibility that the photograph had been staged not to reassure the powerful, but to speak to those who knew how to see, that it belonged to a visual language developed in secrecy, understood only by those navigating the machinery of racial oppression from inside it. The historian closed his notebook. "If this is what I think it is," he said, "then this photograph was never meant for us. It was meant to outlast us." Archives and the first connections. The photograph did not yield its meaning all at once. It resisted interpretation the way all dangerous records do, by fragmenting itself across unrelated archives, forcing investigators to follow threads that seemed, at first, unconnected. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The research team began where institutions always begin: paperwork. Census schedules from the turn of the century, county court dockets, property records, employment ledgers, church registries kept by hand and rarely revised. Nothing in these sources mentioned the photograph directly. No studio receipt, no names written on the backing board, no catalog entry tying it to a family collection. It was as if the image had been deliberately stripped of its anchors. Then, patterns emerged. In the labor records of a Midwestern industrial estate, owned on paper by a family whose wealth spanned rail transport, grain processing, and timber, appeared a name that surfaced repeatedly, then vanished, then reappeared altered: E. Johnson. Sometimes listed as Eli, sometimes as Elijah, sometimes without an age, sometimes without a residence. The handwriting changed. The ink did not. Parallel to this, in private correspondence preserved in a separate archive, another name appeared with unsettling consistency: Henry Collins. Collins was the educated son of a regional industrialist. His letters, preserved among business papers that had never been digitized, spoke the language of reform: measured, careful, indirect. He wrote of inefficiencies, of irregularities in labor arrangements, of men bound to obligations that did not resolve cleanly. His tone suggested discomfort, not outrage. A man taught to question quietly. What caught the researcher's attention was not what he said, but what followed him. Court cases filed under Collins's name appeared in docket books, then ended abruptly. Motions withdrawn without explanation, hearings scheduled and then erased with a single line drawn through the entry. Judges changed. Clerks' notes went missing. The legal system seemed to recoil from him. Eli Johnson appeared in those same margins. In one county ledger, Johnson was listed as a resident laborer on Collins' family property. In another, he was recorded as transient, despite having worked the same land for years. His address shifted without reason. His employer changed on paper, but not in practice. Debts appeared next to his name, small at first, then escalating. Charges for housing, for tools, for food, the kind of arithmetic designed never to resolve. Newspapers from the period filled in the negative space. Short notices reported accidents at industrial sites owned by prominent families, men crushed by equipment, men drowned in rivers that bordered properties they were never meant to leave, lawsuits filed by widows that vanished between columns. Always the same language: unfortunate, unavoidable, closed. Henry Collins's name hovered near several of these stories, not as defendant, not as plaintiff, but as witness, as someone present when questions were asked. The researchers realized they were not looking at a single injustice. They were tracing a system. Long after slavery's legal end, mechanisms remained in place to extract labor through fear and paperwork. Men like Eli Johnson were trapped not by chains visible to the public, but by documents designed to look lawful, contracts enforced by sheriffs, debts enforced by courts that never ruled in their favor. The photograph, now reconsidered in this light, took on a sharper edge. It did not mark friendship between two men. It documented proximity within a structure of control. Henry Collins stood inside the system that protected him. Eli Johnson stood inside the system that erased him. The photograph froze the moment when those two realities touched and recorded the tension of that contact. One researcher noted something that would later trouble the entire investigation. In every archive where Collins's papers appeared, there were signs of removal, missing folders, numbered gaps, a sense that someone had audited the record long after the events themselves and decided what could remain. The photograph, by contrast, had survived untouched, not because it was harmless, but because it was unreadable to those who did not know what to look for. By the end of the week, the team no longer spoke of coincidence. They spoke of architecture, of a hidden order maintained through omission rather than force, and of an image that pointed silently to the existence of a crime, so normalized it had been filed away as labor. What they held was not proof of a single tragedy. It was evidence of a machine, the hidden system, and visual codes. The photograph stopped being an object and became a key. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. Once the researchers accepted that the image had been designed to communicate rather than commemorate, their approach changed. They stopped asking what does it show and began asking who would have understood it. That question pulled them out of conventional archives and into the margins, into correspondence never meant for publication, into the half-remembered practices of people who had learned that survival required silence and symbolism. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, overt resistance had become nearly impossible. Lynching functioned as spectacle. Courts functioned as theater. Any direct challenge to labor exploitation invited swift erasure. What survived were systems that did not announce themselves. One such system was visual. Photographers occupied a strange position in American society. They were tradesmen, artists, technicians, and witnesses. They moved freely between social classes. They posed judges, laborers, ministers, and prisoners using the same equipment. Some were sympathetic. Some were complicit. A few understood how an image could say what words could not. The team began cross-referencing unusual studio portraits from the same decades, images that had previously been dismissed as odd, theatrical, or poorly composed. Patterns emerged, hands placed unnaturally, objects introduced that did not belong, books opened to unreadable pages, windows painted into backdrops with no visible exit. In this visual language, hand placement carried meaning. A relaxed hand meant compliance. A clenched one indicated imminent danger. Pressure applied by another signaled surveillance or control. Background elements functioned as qualifiers. Chains did not always mean bondage. They meant illegal bondage, labor enforced without lawful sentence, hidden behind contracts and debt. The photograph of the two men fit these codes precisely. The white man's hand applied force, not comfort. The black man's fist communicated readiness, not submission. The library backdrop declared legitimacy. The chain negated it. Together they formed a visual indictment, respectability masking captivity. Researchers uncovered references to informal networks that had operated in parallel to official institutions, pastors who kept duplicate ledgers, teachers who memorized testimonies instead of writing them down, lawyers who advised clients never to file but to document, mutual aid societies that preserved fragments, names, dates, gestures, distributed across families so no single raid could erase them all. Photographs were part of this architecture. They could be misfiled, misunderstood, inherited without explanation. They could survive where affidavits could not. Most importantly, they could be read decades later by those who knew the code, or rediscovered by those willing to question why something felt wrong. The team realized the image was not meant to expose a crime immediately. It was meant to endure long enough to become undeniable. This reframed the deaths, the vanished court cases, the missing files. The system did not fear exposure. It relied on delay, on the assumption that time would blunt outrage and convert violence into abstraction. The photograph defied that strategy. It waited. One internal memo noted something chilling. Similar images existed, but few had survived intact. Many had been cropped, others retouched, backgrounds altered, hands softened. Someone had worked, quietly and efficiently, to neutralize the language. This one had escaped, perhaps because it never circulated widely, perhaps because its meaning was invisible to those invested in suppressing it, or perhaps because the person tasked with erasing it understood exactly what it was and chose not to. By the end of the month, the researchers stopped calling the photograph evidence. They called it a node, one point in a network designed to preserve truth when truth itself was dangerous. It was not a relic of the past. It was a message delayed by fear. The human story behind the image. Once the system revealed itself, the investigation narrowed, not outward, but inward. Every structure, no matter how vast, depends on individual bodies to function. Someone had borne the weight of that photograph. Someone had stood under the pressure of that hand. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. That person was Eli Johnson. The records did not agree on when he was born. Some listed a year, others left the space blank. What remained consistent was absence. Eli appeared in documents as labor, as debt, as notation, but never as a voice. He entered the workforce young, the son of formerly enslaved parents, who had learned quickly that freedom without protection was a liability. They moved when they could, changed churches, avoided notice. None of it was enough. By his late teens, Eli was bound to a labor contract tied to industrial land owned by the Collins family. On paper, it was legal employment. In practice, it was enclosure. The wages never covered the debts assigned to him. The debts grew regardless of payment. Leaving meant arrest. Staying meant survival. Henry Collins grew up watching this arrangement without understanding it. He was educated, sent away to study law, returned with ideas that had no place in the machinery that sustained his family's wealth. He noticed irregularities others ignored. He asked questions clerks could not answer without risk. And he noticed Eli, not as property, but as a man caught inside a mechanism designed to grind quietly. Their interactions were limited, watched, documented, but they occurred. And somewhere in those encounters, Henry recognized that legality and justice had parted ways long before he arrived. He began collecting documents, contracts that contradicted statutes, ledgers that recorded impossible balances, testimonies copied by hand and hidden among business papers. He did not confront the system. He studied it. That restraint would later be misread as complicity. The photograph was taken during this period. Studio records suggest it was commissioned discreetly, paid in cash. The pose was chosen carefully. Every element considered. It was not meant to provoke, it was meant to persist. The moment before something broke. 2 weeks later, Henry Collins was dead. The official cause was an industrial accident, machinery malfunction, no witnesses, no inquiry beyond the minimum required. The case closed within hours. His papers were seized under the authority of estate management. Several boxes were never returned to the archive. That same night, Eli Johnson vanished. No arrest warrant, no death record, no notice in the papers. His debts were marked resolved without explanation. His name stopped appearing entirely. The system absorbed the disruption and sealed itself. For decades, that was the end of the story. Until the photograph led investigators somewhere, the archives could not. To families who remembered without writing. To names carried forward through whispers. To descendants who had preserved fragments without knowing why. In a box passed down through generations, wrapped in cloth that had been repaired again and again, they found letters. A diary written in careful, compressed script, and another copy of the photograph. The diary described a plan executed under cover of night. Assistance from people whose names were never written. Legal papers obtained at unbearable cost. a border crossed under a name that was not his, a life rebuilt deliberately small. Henry Collins's death was not an accident. It was the price of interruption. The gripping hand in the photograph was not dominance alone. It was risk acknowledged. The clenched fist was not anger. It was readiness. The image did not mark equality achieved, but truth recorded at the edge of catastrophe. Eli survived because someone else did not, and the photograph endured because it had been asked to remember what the system could not afford to let survive in ink. Descendants and the final proof. The truth did not surface in a courtroom or a ledger. It emerged the way it always had, quietly, through people who had learned that survival meant remembering without announcing what they knew. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The researchers followed the diary's final clues into private hands. Not public archives, not museums, but family storage spaces, attics, basements, the backs of closets where objects were kept, not for their value, but because someone had once said, "Do not throw this away." Eli Johnson's descendants had inherited fragments without context, letters copied and recopied, a name crossed out and replaced, a story told only when children were old enough to understand why silence had once been necessary. They did not speak easily. Generations had been raised on the knowledge that records could be weaponized. That attention invited correction. That truth survived best when disguised as family memory. But the photograph changed the terms. When shown the image, the oldest living descendant recognized it instantly. Not from history books, but from repetition. "That was the proof," she said. "That's what he left behind, so nobody could say it didn't happen." The letters confirmed what the archives had denied. Henry Collins had prepared legal filings intended to challenge the labor contracts binding Eli. He understood they would not succeed openly. Judges were compromised. Clerks were loyal to property, not law. The filings were never meant to be heard. They were meant to exist, to establish that someone had objected, that someone had seen clearly. The night Henry died, those papers were removed, but copies survived, carried out by hands that knew how to move unnoticed. Eli's escape was not sudden. It was timed, routed through people who asked no questions aloud. Each stop was temporary, each name provisional. The diary ended abruptly after describing the crossing into another state. The final entry did not celebrate freedom. It recorded exhaustion, fear, and an instruction. Do not return. Do not write. Live quietly. He did. Eli rebuilt his life under a different identity. He worked jobs that left no paper trail. Married. Raised children who knew him only as a careful man, who avoided attention. He did not tell them where he had come from, only that the world did not forgive visibility. The photograph, preserved separately, passed down as an object of gravity. It was never displayed, never explained fully. It was taken out only when decisions were made, moves, name changes, moments when risk was near. It functioned less as memory than as orientation, a reminder of what vigilance cost. When the fragments were finally assembled, letters, diary, duplicate photograph, the meaning of the gestures was no longer interpretive. It was explicit. The gripping hand was not affection. It was danger acknowledged and recorded. The clenched fist was not rage. It was readiness to run. The library backdrop was not aspiration. It was irony. The chain was not metaphor. It was accusation. Henry Collins had not been naive. He had known the cost. The photograph was his final act of resistance, not to save himself, but to ensure that the lie would eventually fail. The researchers understood then why the system had erased so thoroughly, why records ended cleanly where lives did not. The truth was coherent, and coherence was intolerable. Nothing in the archive contradicted the story anymore. Only its absence had. What survived had done so because it refused to speak plainly, because it trusted time more than institutions, because it knew that one day Someone would look closely enough to see that the hands were telling the story, the mouths never could. Public reckoning and historical justice. The photograph was unveiled without ceremony. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The museum did not announce a revelation. It did not promise closure. The exhibition was framed carefully, almost defensively, titled in neutral language that suggested inquiry rather than accusation. Yet from the moment the image was mounted behind glass, something shifted in the room. Visitors slowed instinctively. They leaned in. They noticed the hands. The photograph was displayed alone at first. No names, no interpretation, no reassurance. Only the enlarged details beside it. The blanched knuckles, the clenched fist, the chain in the painted background. The curators resisted the temptation to explain too quickly. They allowed silence to do what decades of documentation had failed to accomplish. Then, the context followed. Labor contracts mounted beside court dockets, with their pages abruptly ending. Ledger books with debts that never resolved. Maps tracing routes that were not roads, but absences. Places where records stopped and lives continued elsewhere. Excerpts from letters reproduced faintly, deliberately difficult to read, mimicking the way truth had survived only in fragments. The effect was cumulative and unsettling. Visitors realized they were not looking at an exception. They were seeing a mechanism laid bare, a system that did not require constant violence, because it had learned to outsource brutality to paperwork. A world where legality was engineered to exhaust resistance rather than confront it. Some lingered for hours. Others left quickly, unsettled, unwilling to articulate why. The photograph no longer functioned as a relic. It operated as testimony. In lectures that followed, historians avoided heroic language. There were no clean victories to celebrate. Henry Collins was not rehabilitated as a martyr. Eli Johnson was not framed as a symbol. The point was not redemption. It was acknowledgement that systems of oppression survived not because they were hidden, but because they were normalized. The museum received letters within weeks. Some came from families who recognized patterns they had never named. Others came from institutions asking, politely, urgently, how the exhibition language might be softened. A few demanded removal. The curators refused. Nothing displayed was speculative. Every claim rested on documents that had existed all along, misfiled or ignored. No court reopened the case. No official apology followed. That absence was noted, not lamented. Justice, the exhibition argued, was not always a verdict. Sometimes it was restoration of sequence, placing events back into the order that power had scrambled, showing that disappearance had been engineered, that silence had been maintained deliberately, that what looked like peace had often been enforced quiet. The final wall text was spare. It did not speak of reconciliation. It spoke of responsibility, of learning how to read what had been designed to be overlooked, of understanding that resistance did not always look like defiance. It often looked like endurance, like documentation, like a single photograph, waiting patiently for a future that might finally see it clearly. When visitors reached the end, they turned back toward the image. Almost all of them did. The photograph had changed while they were not looking. It no longer suggested friendship. It suggested proximity under threat. It suggested courage that did not announce itself. It stood as proof that even within systems built to erase, individuals had chosen to record, that someone had trusted time more than institutions. That truth, when forced into silence, had learned to speak through gesture instead of words. The exhibition closed each night in quiet. The photograph remained. And somewhere beyond the museum walls, the system that created it continued, altered, renamed, but not gone. The image did not claim to end that story. It only ensured that it could no longer be denied.